I never expected a lime green piece of paper would ignite a neighborhood war, but that's exactly what happened on that otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. As I walked out to my car, police uniform crisp and coffee in hand, I spotted it tucked under my windshield wiper, an HOA violation notice for $79. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, snatching the paper and staring at my perfectly maintained lawn. The citation read, "Improper lawn maintenance," in bold letters. Though my grass looked exactly as it had for the 15 years I'd lived here, neat, green, and recently mowed. That's when I heard the distinctive click-clack of high heels approaching on the sidewalk. "Good morning." The voice was sugary sweet, but had an edge that made my teeth hurt. Karen Mitchell, our newest HOA board member, was making her morning inspection rounds, tablet in hand. She'd moved in just 6 months ago and immediately campaigned for a board position. 3 weeks in her role, she was making everyone miserable. "Miss Mitchell," I nodded politely, holding up the notice. "Mind explaining this? My lawn meets all reasonable standards." She barely looked up from her tablet. Section 7, paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is approximately 3.5 inches. She tapped away, probably documenting another violation somewhere. I took a deep breath, remembering my police training for dealing with difficult people. "I've been busy with a major case at work. I'll mow it this weekend." "Rules are rules," she chirped, finally looking up. "The fine doubles if not paid within 72 hours. "Oh. And you might want to do something about those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list." "My garden gnomes?" I felt my blood pressure rising, but kept my voice steady. "Those gnomes were my late wife's collection. I wasn't aware we needed approval for garden decorations that have been here for over a decade. New board, new rules." She waved her tablet cheerfully. "We're bringing this neighborhood into the modern age. No more tacky decorations, lowering property values." As she clicked away down the sidewalk, I noticed she was stopping at Sarah's house next door. Sarah was an ER nurse who had just finished a grueling night shift. The last thing she needed was Karen's morning harassment about her garbage bins being out too long. I watched as Karen started taking photos of Sarah's property, and something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about my lawn or my gnomes anymore. In my 25 years of law enforcement, I'd learned to spot patterns of harassment and abuse of power. Karen wasn't just being strict, she was targeting specific residents. Back in my car, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the neighborhood Facebook. The complaints about Karen were piling up. Mark, the firefighter on the corner, had been fined for his kid's basketball hoop. The elderly couple across the street got a violation for their unapproved rose bushes. Even the local teacher had been cited for parking his car in his own driveway because it was too old and unsightly. I was about to pull out when I spotted Karen taking more pictures of my gnomes. She didn't know it yet, but she just made a serious mistake. Being chief of police had taught me one very important thing. Sometimes the biggest crimes aren't the ones that make headlines, but the small injustices that chip away at a community's spirit. As I drove to work, my mind was already forming a plan. Karen thought she had all the power, but she had no idea who she was really dealing with, or what I would discover when I started digging into her perfect facade. I never expected a lime green piece of paper would ignite a war in our peaceful suburban neighborhood. But that's exactly what happened on that sunny Tuesday morning. As I stepped out my front door, travel mug of coffee in one hand and police badge in the other, I spotted something fluttering under my windshield wiper. "What now?" I muttered, assuming it was another takeout menu from the new Thai place down the street. But my stomach dropped when I got closer. An HOA violation notice. $79 for improper lawn maintenance. Seriously? I looked back at my lawn, perfectly mowed just 3 days ago. It was neat, green, and absolutely fine by any reasonable standard. The sound of high heels clicking on concrete made me turn around. Karen Mitchell, our newest HOA board member, was power walking down the sidewalk, tablet in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, looking like she was hunting for her next victim. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but had an edge that made my teeth hurt. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I held up the violation notice. "Mind explaining this? My lawn meets all community standards." Karen barely looked up from her tablet. Section 7, paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines clearly states grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is approximately 3.5 inches. She tapped something on her screen, probably documenting another poor soul's violation. "You measure my grass?" My blood pressure ticked up a notch. But 25 years in law enforcement had taught me to keep my cool with difficult people. "I've been busy with a major case at work," I explained calmly. "I'll mow it this weekend." "Rules are rules," she chirped, finally looking up. The fine doubles if not paid within 72 hours. Oh, and you might want to do something about those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list. My jaw tightened. Those gnomes were my late wife's collection. She'd started it 15 years ago, and each one held memory. I wasn't aware we needed approval for garden decorations that have been here for over a decade. New board, new rules. She waved her tablet cheerfully. We're bringing this neighborhood into the modern age. No more tacky decorations, lowering property values. As she strutted away, I noticed her stopping at my neighbor Sarah's house. Sarah was an ER nurse who just finished a grueling 12-hour night shift. The last thing she needed was Karen's morning harassment. I watched as Karen started taking photos of Sarah's garbage bins, which had probably been left out because Sarah was too exhausted to bring them in after a shift. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about my lawn or my gnomes anymore. Back in my car, I scrolled through her neighborhood Facebook. Complaints about Karen were piling up faster than fallen leaves in October. Mark, the firefighter on the corner, had been fined for his kids' basketball hoop. The elderly couple across the street got violations for their unapproved rose bushes. Even the local kindergarten teacher had been cited for parking her unsightly 2010 Honda in her own driveway. The pattern was becoming clear as day. Karen wasn't just being strict, she was specifically targeting people who worked long or irregular hours. People who might not have time to fight back. Through my rearview mirror, I spotted Karen taking more pictures of my garden gnomes, her red fingernails tapping furiously on her tablet screen. She didn't know it yet, but she just made a serious mistake. See, I wasn't just any resident. Being chief of police had taught me one very important thing. Sometimes the biggest crimes aren't the ones that make headlines, but the small injustices that chip away at a community's spirit. As I drove to work, my mind was already forming a plan. Karen thought she had all the power, but she had no idea who she was dealing with, or what I would discover when I started digging into her perfect facade. The game was on, and Karen Mitchell was about to learn that some people you just shouldn't mess with, especially not over 0.5 inches of grass. The next morning, I noticed something strange as I drove through our neighborhood. Karen was following a pattern. She wasn't just randomly enforcing rules. She was deliberately targeting specific houses. I pulled over and watched her through my rearview mirror. First, she stopped at Dr. Wilson's house. He works overnight shifts at the emergency room. Then Mrs. Garcia's place, a single mom who teaches at 2 different schools. Then Mark's house, our local firefighter who often works 48-hour shifts. What the hell? I muttered to myself. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. That afternoon, I ran into Mark in his driveway. He was taking down his kid's basketball hoop, his face flushed with anger. "Chief Johnson," he called out when he saw me. "Can you believe this crap? 20 years on the force, fighting fires, saving lives, and I can't even let my kids play basketball in our own driveway." He handed me a lime green violation notice, identical to mine. $150 fine for an unapproved recreational structure. "My boys have had this hoop for 5 years," Mark said, his voice breaking slightly. "Never a problem until Hurricane Karen blew into town." "You're not the only one," I replied, showing him my own citation. "I've been seeing these all over the neighborhood, but not randomly. It's like she's targeting certain people." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Now that you mention it, Jenkins next door has a hoop too. No violation, but Jenkins worked from home. I'm gone 48 hours at a time sometimes." My police instincts kicked into high gear. "Has she given you any other citations?" "For in the last month," Mark exclaimed. "Trash cans, lawn height, a toy my son left out overnight when I was working the Henderson fire. It's like she knows exactly when I'm not around." I pulled out my phone and opened a neighborhood Facebook group. "Mind if I post something quick?" 10 minutes later, my post asking about recent HOA violations exploded with replies. "Got fined for parking my teacher's aide car in my own driveway because it's unsightly." Mrs. Thompson received $200 fine for medical equipment delivery while on night shift. Dr. Sanders. Kids chalk drawings on our sidewalk. $50 fine issued at 7 a.m. when I was dropping kids at daycare. Emily Rodriguez. The pattern was unmistakable. Karen was systematically targeting residents who worked long hours or irregular shifts, especially first responders, medical workers, and teachers. That evening, I spread all the reports across my kitchen table, organizing them by profession and time of citation. The picture became crystal clear. If you worked nights, long shifts, or irregular hours, you were on Karen's hit list. My doorbell rang. It was Sarah, still in her hospital scrubs, eyes red from either exhaustion or tears, probably both. "Chief," she said, voice trembling as she handed me a stack of violations. "She's threatening to put a lien on my house. I can't keep up with these fines on a nurse's salary." Sarah had been hit with 8 violations in just 3 weeks. all while she was working night shifts or sleeping during the day after saving lives all night. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. That slow burn of righteous anger that made me become a cop in the first place. Sarah, would you mind if I made copies of these? As she left, I spotted Karen across the street, taking photos of the Martinez family's mailbox. Their dad was a paramedic working double shifts during the current flu outbreak. I closed my blinds and pulled out my laptop. Being chief of police had its advantages, like knowing exactly how to conduct a proper investigation. Karen thought she was hunting vulnerable residents. She had no idea she had just become the hunted. 2 days after discovering that ridiculous lime green ticket, I pulled into my street after a brutal double shift. We dealt with a bank robbery downtown, and all I wanted was to park my car and get some sleep. But what I saw made me slam on my brakes. 2 black SUVs with HOA security emblazoned on the sides were completely blocking my driveway. Seriously? Over a $79 fine that wasn't even legitimate? I watched in disbelief as Karen strutted across my front lawn in her designer suit, tablet in hand, taking pictures of everything from my garden hose to my welcome mat. Each flash of her camera made my blood pressure rise a little more. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping from my unmarked police car. "You're blocking my driveway, and I need to get to my garage." Karen spun around, her perfectly styled blonde hair swishing like a shampoo commercial. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Johnson, our neighborhood's most persistent rule break." She tapped her tablet screen with her long red nails. "Let's see. Unpaid fine for lawn height violations. Unapproved garden gnome placement and nap." She paused for dramatic effect. "Non-regulation mailbox color." I couldn't help but laugh. "Non-regulation mailbox color? The mailbox is white. It's been white for the 15 years I've lived here. According to our new guidelines approved last week, all mailboxes must be painted pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company collection. Your mailbox is clearly classic white, a completely different shade." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Karen, I understand you're new to the neighborhood, but these security vehicles are parked illegally. They're blocking access to my property, which is a violation of City Ordinance 20 to 345. Her smile flickered for just a second. "I have full authority as HOA board member to enforce our community standards. These security officers," she gestured to 2 guys in ill-fitting uniforms leaning against their SUVs, "are here to ensure compliance." That's when I noticed something odd about their badges. They looked almost like real police badges, but not quite. As chief of police, I knew every licensed security company in our jurisdiction, and Mitchell Security Solutions wasn't one of them. "Look," I said, trying reason one more time, "I get that you're trying to maintain property values, but blocking someone's driveway over a $79 fine isn't just unreasonable, it's illegal. I'd hate to have to escalate this." Karen's face turned as red as her nails. "Is that a threat, Mr. Johnson? Because I have photos documenting every violation on your property, and the HOA board will be very interested in your aggressive attitude." She turned to the security guards. "Make a note of his threatening behavior." As they fumbled with their notepads, I noticed their shoulder patches were peeling off. They looked like they'd been printed at a local copy shop. Something wasn't adding up here, and my cop instincts were kicking in hard. I pulled up the city's business license database on my phone, keeping one eye on Karen as she continued photographing my property. 3 taps later, I had what I needed, or rather, what wasn't there. No licensed security company registered under her name or her brother's, who I'd seen at the last HOA meeting wearing a similar uniform. Just then, Mrs. Garcia from next door came rushing out of her house in her nurse's scrubs. "Chief Johnson, I'm so glad you're here. They've been blocking my driveway too, and I'm late for my hospital shift." I watched Karen's face closely as she heard the word chief. Her eyes widened just slightly, and her tablet nearly slipped from her fingers. But instead of backing down, she lifted her chin higher. "Your title doesn't matter here. Chief Johnson. HOA rules apply to everyone equally. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to document a few more violations before I process the additional fines for your uncooperative behavior." As she walked away, clipboard clutched her chest like armor. I knew this was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning. I had a feeling Karen's perfect HOA world was about to get a lot more complicated, especially once I started looking into exactly how these new security measures got approved. One thing was certain. Karen had no idea who she was messing with, and her fake security operation had just made this very, very personal. I never expected a simple lawn dispute to uncover something so disturbing in our peaceful neighborhood. It started when Sarah, the ER nurse who lives 3 houses down, knocked on my door at 6 a.m. still in her scrubs and fighting back tears. She just finished a brutal overnight shift dealing with a bus crash, only to find her entire front yard plastered with bright orange violation notices. "Chief," she said, her hands shaking as she held up the stack of papers. "They're threatening to put a lien on my house because my garbage bin stayed out for an extra day while I was working a double shift during the crisis." The sight of this dedicated nurse, who just spent 16 hours saving lives being harassed over garbage bins, made my blood boil. But Sarah wasn't alone. As I started asking around, more stories emerged. Mark, the firefighter on Maple Street, showed me citation after citation for his kid's basketball hoop, the same hoop that had been there for 5 years without issue before Karen joined the board. The Martinez family got fined because their Christmas lights stayed up 2 days past Karen's arbitrary deadline. They'd been at their grandmother's funeral. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, spreading out all the complaints like pieces of a puzzle. The pattern was clear as day. Karen wasn't just being picky, she was specifically targeting homes where people worked long or irregular hours. First responders, nurses, doctors, firefighters, people who couldn't always be home to jump at her every demand. My police instincts kicked in. I started mapping out every citation issued in the past 3 months since Karen took power. The cluster of violations formed a clear pattern around homes of emergency workers and those who opposed her during the HOA election. This wasn't random. This was calculated harassment. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Tom, my deputy who lived in the next subdivision. "Chief, you're not going to believe this. Remember that flooding issue last spring? Just found out Karen's brother's company got the contract for drainage repair. Cost 3 times what the other bids quoted." I leaned back in my chair, thinking about how Karen had laughed in my face earlier that day when I tried to reason with her about my own fine. "Rules are rules," she'd said, that smug smile never leaving her face. But now I understood these weren't rules. This was a power trip, and possibly something even more sinister. Just then, my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chun from across the street, an elderly widow who'd lived here longer than anyone. "Chief," she whispered, looking over her shoulder nervously. "I saw them installing cameras on the streetlights today. They didn't ask permission. Karen says it's for security, but they're all pointed at specific houses, including yours." My jaw tightened. Unauthorized surveillance in my jurisdiction? Now Karen wasn't just being a nuisance. She was potentially breaking the law. But I needed more proof before I could act. If I moved too quickly, she'd play the victim, claim I was abusing my position as chief. As I walked Mrs. Chen home, I spotted Karen in her driveway, talking to 2 men I'd never seen before. They wore uniforms from her brother's security company, but something about them seemed off. My gut told me there was more to this story. And in 20 years of police work, my gut had rarely been wrong. The next morning, I drove by Sarah's house during my coffee run. Sure enough, Karen was there with her tablet, taking photos of Sarah's mailbox while the exhausted nurse was likely trying to sleep after another night shift. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Morning, Karen. Quite dedicated to your HOA duties, aren't you?" She jumped slightly, not having heard me approach. "Just doing my job, Chief. Unlike some people who think the rules don't apply to them." Chen mentioned, "Did the board approve those? Because I don't recall seeing any minutes about surveillance equipment in a residential area." Karen's smile faltered for just a second. "The board gave me emergency authorization powers last month. It's all perfectly legal. I'd love to see that documentation," I replied. "Mind sending it over to my office today?" "I'm very busy," she snapped. "You'll get it when I have time." As she stalked off, I noticed something interesting, a slight tremor in her hand as she clutched her tablet. Karen was nervous, and people only get nervous when they have something to hide. Back at the station, I had Jenny from our records department pull the HOA financial statements for the past 6 months. What we found was shocking. Over $200,000 in new contracts awarded to companies with variations of the Mitchell name, all at rates significantly higher than market value. I closed my eyes, remembering what my mentor used to say, "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." Karen had built herself a little kingdom of fear and intimidation, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd gotten too confident, too sloppy. She didn't realize that while she was watching us, we were watching her too. The real question now wasn't just about stopping Karen. It was about exposing the whole corrupt system she'd built. As I looked at the growing pile of evidence on my desk, I knew tomorrow would be a very interesting day at the HOA emergency meeting, especially when they discovered who had just been quietly appointed to the county's Housing Authority Oversight Committee. Game on, Karen. I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about how Karen had been treating everyone in our neighborhood. Something didn't feel right about the whole situation. While drinking my morning coffee, I remembered an important lesson from my early days as a rookie cop: follow the money. The security company blocking my driveway had seemed oddly eager to do Karen's bidding, and their uniforms looked suspiciously new. At work, I asked Jenny from our record department to run a basic business check on the security company, Elite Neighborhood Watch Services. Within minutes, my suspicions grew strong. The company had only been registered 3 months ago, right after Karen joined the HOA board. The owner's last name matched Karen's maiden name, and the business address led to a P.O. box instead of a real office. Well, I muttered, scanning through the documents. Keeping it all in the family, aren't we, Karen? I drove by Sarah's house on my lunch break. She was just getting home from her hospital shift, looking exhausted. "Chief," she called out when she saw me. "They left another notice this morning. I can't keep paying these fines on a nurse's salary." She showed me a stack of violation notices, all signed by Karen, all citing obscure HOA rules that seemed to target working people specifically. Back at the station, I dug deeper into public records. Karen's brother, Tom Mitchell, had a history of failed security companies in 3 different states. Each time, complaints had been filed about aggressive tactics and unauthorized vehicle blocking, but they'd always disappeared before any real investigation could start. My next stop was the county clerk's office. The friendly clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, helped me pull HOA registration documents from the last 6 months. Flipping through the pages, I found exactly what I needed. Karen had never disclosed her family connection to the security company when bidding for the HOA contract. That was a clear violation of the HOA's own conflict of interest rules. But the real gold mine came when I checked Karen's home business registration. She'd been running a daycare center from her garage, caring for 6 kids at a time. The HOA rules strictly prohibited commercial activities, the very same rules she'd been using to fine other neighbors for having home offices. Even better, she didn't have proper childcare licensing from the state. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark, the firefighter. "Chief, you need to see this." He sent photos of Karen's security company cars parked in fire lanes around the neighborhood. "We couldn't get a truck through there if we needed to," his message read. I spent the rest of the afternoon building my case. Property maps showed Karen had extended her back fence 2 feet beyond her property line. Security camera footage from my cruiser proved her company had blocked emergency vehicle access multiple times. The HOA's financial records revealed she'd been pushing the board to increase fines while directing all security contracts to her brother's company. The evidence was mounting, but I had to be smart about how I used it. Karen had friends on the city council, and I needed to make sure everything was completely legal and properly documented. I made copies of every document and stored them in both digital and physical formats. Years of police work had taught me to always have backups. Just as I was finishing up, Officer Rodriguez rushed into my office. "Chief, you won't believe this. That security company tried to boot Dr. Thompson's car at the emergency room entrance. He was rushing in for a critical surgery." My blood boiled, but I kept my cool. This was the final piece I needed. I sat back in my chair, looking at the wall of evidence I gathered. Karen had no idea what was coming. In her rush to build her little kingdom of power, she'd left a trail of violations that would shock even her supporters on the HOA. The real question now was timing, when and how to present this information for maximum impact. A text message lit up my phone screen. It was from one of my sergeants. Karen just submitted a proposal for expanded security measures. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow night. I smiled, knowing the perfect moment had just presented itself. Sometimes the best investigations are the ones where you let your target walk right into the trap they've set for others. Karen thought she was the hunter. Little did she know, she was about to become the hunted. I walked into that HOA meeting room with every piece of evidence carefully organized in my folder. The room was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors show up before. Karen sat at the front table, tapping away at her tablet like she owned the place. She didn't even look up when I entered. "Before we vote on the new security measures," I announced, standing up from my seat in the back, "I'd like to address the board." Karen's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as I walked to the front. For those who don't know me, I'm James Mitchell. I've lived here for 15 years. And I'm also the chief of police for our city. The whispers started immediately. Karen's tablet slipped from her hands, clattering on the table. I could see her brother, the security company owner, shifting uncomfortably in his chair by the door. Over the past 3 months, there have been 47 fines issued in our community. 35 of them were given to first responders and essential workers. I pulled out my first piece of evidence, a color-coded map showing every cited house. Notice any pattern? The board members leaned forward, studying the clusters of red dots. Mrs. Thompson, our retired school principal and longest-serving board member, adjusted her glasses with trembling hands. "But that's not all," I continued, pulling out more documents. The security company hired to enforce these citations, Mitchell Security LLC, isn't just unlicensed. It's operating illegally under our state's private security contractor laws. Karen's brother stood up, heading for the door, but two uniformed officers I'd stationed outside were already waiting. Karen jumped to her feet. "This is ridiculous. You can't use police resources for personal vendettas." "You're right," I smiled. "That's why everything I'm presenting tonight came from public records and legal channels, including the documents showing your home-based business that violates Section 7 of our HOA agreement." The room erupted. Neighbors started sharing their own stories. The single mom fined for Christmas lights in January while she worked double shifts. The elderly couple targeted for their medical equipment delivery van. The kindergarten teacher cited for children's chalk drawings on her own driveway. Mrs. Thompson stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. I moved to immediately remove Karen Mitchell from the board and launch a full audit of all fines issued under her authority. Second, 5 voices called out at once. Karen's face had turned from red to white. "You can't do this." I was protecting property values. I was maintaining standards. "No," I said quietly. "You were bullying people who didn't have time to fight back. But that ends today." The vote was unanimous. As Karen stormed out, her designer handbag swinging wildly, neighbors started hugging each other. Sarah, the ER nurse who'd received 8 citations, was crying as she hugged Mark, the firefighter who'd nearly lost his kid's basketball hoop. But Karen wasn't going quietly. She spun around at the door, her face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Johnson. My brother's company has contracts. We have rights." "Actually," I replied calmly, holding up another document. "Those contracts were obtained through fraud. You failed to disclose your family relationship as required by state law and HOA bylaws. That makes them null and void." A collective gasp filled the room. Karen's brother was already being questioned by my officers outside. "And as for those security cameras you installed without permits," I continued, "they're being removed as we speak. Invasion of privacy is a serious offense, Ms. Mitchell. I'd be careful about what you say next." For once, Karen was speechless. She looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only stern faces. Even her former supporters on the board were avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Karen, please hand over your HOA access codes and documents before you leave." Karen's shoulders slumped in defeat. She dropped her tablet on the table and stalked out. I stayed late, helping Mrs. Thompson start the paperwork to refund every unfair fine we found. Over $115,000 worth of citations, each one more ridiculous than the last. As we worked, neighbors kept dropping by with coffee, snacks, and stories of relief. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said as we finished up around midnight, "I've been on this board for 17 years. HOAs are supposed to help communities, not terrorized. How do we let it get this bad?" I thought about it for a moment. Power attracts those who want it for the wrong reasons. But today showed me something important too. This community is stronger than one power-hungry bully. As I walked to my car, I saw the stars shining brightly over our neighborhood. For the first time in months, there were no security SUVs blocking driveways. No cameras watching our every move. No fear of waking up to lime green violation notices. Sometimes justice doesn't come from big dramatic courtroom battles. Sometimes it's just neighbors standing together, saying enough is enough. And sometimes the biggest satisfaction comes from watching a playground bully realize they picked on the wrong person. The next morning, I drove to work past Karen's house. A moving truck was already in her driveway. Her brother's security vehicles were gone too, replaced by legitimate patrol cars, making sure the moving company had proper permits. Well, that didn't take long. I chuckled to myself. Word spread quickly through our neighborhood. People started coming out again. Kids played in their yards without fear of citations. Lawn decorations reappeared overnight, like colorful mushrooms after a spring rain. Mrs. Chen's Chinese New Year lanterns, Mark's kids' basketball hoop, the Martinez family's flamingos. At the station, we received reports that Karen's brother had suddenly closed his security company and was leaving town too. Amazing how quickly cockroaches scatter when you turn on the lights. The HOA board, now led by Mrs. Thompson, worked tirelessly to undo Karen's damage. They voted unanimously to refund every fine issued during Karen's reign of terror. The total was staggering, over $115,000 in just 3 months. Some families have been hit with thousands in penalties for violations as ridiculous as excessive birdwatching and non-regulation mailbox paint finish. "I can't believe we never questioned this," Mr. Jenkins, another board member, told me as we helped sort through the pile of refund checks. "She just seemed so confident, and she had all these binders full of rules." "That's how bullies work," I replied. "They act like they have authority and people assume they do. 1 week after the emergency meeting, Mrs. Thompson organized a community barbecue in the park. The turnout was incredible. Neighbors who'd been avoiding each other for fear of being reported were now laughing together, sharing food, and swapping Karen stories. She fined me because my roses were excessively fragrant. Mrs. Patel laughed, serving up her famous curry to a line of appreciative neighbors. I got written up because my son's remote control car was non-period appropriate for our neighborhood aesthetic. Mark added, flipping burgers. My personal favorite, I chimed in, was my non-regulation mailbox color. White instead of white. The laughter that rippled through the crowd was healing. Even better was seeing the kids playing freely again. Chalk drawings decorated driveways. Bikes and scooters lay scattered on lawns. Basketball games ran late into the evening with no fear of clipboard-wielding tyrants. The next HOA meeting was standing room only, but for positive reasons this time. Mrs. Thompson proposed new bylaws requiring full transparency in all board decisions and creating a resident review committee for any fine over $25. It passed unanimously. This is what community governance should be, she said, smiling at the packed room. Not about power, but about making our neighborhood better for everyone. The best moment came a week later. I was watering my lawn, exactly 3.5 inches tall, when Sarah's 7-year-old daughter, Emma, ran up to my front yard carrying something in her hands. Chief Johnson, she called, waving excitedly. I made this for you. She handed me a handmade card with a crayon drawing of me in my police uniform, standing in front of a rainbow-colored house. Inside, in wobbly child's handwriting, it read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." I knelt down to her level. "Thank you, Emma. That's very kind. Mommy says you made the mean lady go away, so she doesn't yell at us anymore when I draw with chalk." Sarah walked up behind her, smiling. "Sorry about that." She insisted on bringing it over herself. "Best card I've ever gotten," I said, genuinely touched. "How are things going?" "Amazing. I actually got to sleep after my shift yesterday without waking up to someone photographing my garbage cans." I laughed. The simple pleasures in life. That card sits on my desk at the station now, reminding me that sometimes the most important police work happens right at home. Our community learned a valuable lesson. It's not about having power. It's about how you use it. And as for Karen, last I heard, she tried to join another HOA board 2 towns over, but somehow they'd already heard all about her experience with us. Seems news travels fast in the world of community governance. Funny how that works, isn't it?